The wind, a relentless sculptor of the American West, whipped across the vast expanse of Ethan's ranch, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the distant lowing of cattle. Dust devils danced like phantom figures on the horizon, ephemeral and wild, mirroring the unsettled nature of Ethan's own existence. His ranch, a sprawling testament to a life carved out of hardship, lay under a sky of an unforgiving, brilliant blue, a canvas stretched taut over a world that demanded constant vigilance. Ethan himself was as weathered and unyielding as the landscape he inhabited. His face, etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and a grief that had long ago settled into the marrow of his bones, rarely betrayed emotion. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a depth that hinted at a past he kept locked away, a past that had left him solitary, a man more comfortable with the silent companionship of his herd than with the complexities of human interaction. The ranch house, a sturdy, timber-framed structure, stood as a solitary sentinel against the immensity of the prairie. Its windows, reflecting the endless sky, offered no hint of the emptiness within. Ethan moved through its rooms with a quiet efficiency, the creak of the floorboards a familiar sound in the pervasive silence. He was a man of routine, his days dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the needs of his livestock, and the stark realities of survival in this unforgiving terrain. He'd inherited the ranch from his father, a man who had believed in the promise of the land, a promise that had ultimately proved as elusive as a mirage. Ethan had inherited the land, the debts, and the gnawing emptiness that had consumed his family. His wife, Eleanor, had been the light that had once illuminated these dusty halls. Her laughter, a melody that had once softened the edges of his world, was now a ghost in the wind, a painful echo that haunted his waking hours and his restless dreams. Their shared hope, a fragile seedling planted in the arid soil of their lives, had withered and died with the child they had desperately longed for. The barrenness of their womb had mirrored the barrenness of their dreams, a silent indictment that had slowly, insidiously, broken Eleanor. Her departure, a slow fading like the setting sun, had left Ethan alone with his grief and the overwhelming weight of the ranch. He'd buried his pain deep, a futile attempt to shield himself from further hurt, and in doing so had built walls around his heart, thick and impenetrable as the adobe he sometimes used to patch the ranch's aging walls. Today the routine felt heavier, the silence more profound. A telegram had arrived 2 days prior, a stark intrusion into his ordered isolation. It was from a distant relative, a plea for help, a request to take in a woman, a certain Sarah who had nowhere else to turn. Ethan, a man of few words and even fewer obligations, had initially dismissed it, but the telegram had been insistent, painting a picture of desperation that had, against his better judgment, stirred a flicker of something akin to compassion within him. He remembered Eleanor's gentle nature, her innate kindness, and the way she'd always championed the lost and the lonely. Perhaps, he'd thought with a sigh that was barely audible above the wind, it was Eleanor's memory that nudged him. Or perhaps it was simply the deep-seated, almost forgotten instinct to offer shelter to those caught in the storm. He stood on the porch, his gaze sweeping across the familiar, endless horizon. The sun, a molten orb, was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and fiery red. A plume of dust, much larger than the ephemeral devils he'd seen earlier, rose in the distance, a sign of an approaching wagon. It was too large for a lone traveler. His heart gave a strange, almost imperceptible lurch. She was coming. The dust, he realized, was settling, and with it, the quiet solitude of his life was about to be disturbed. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mixture of apprehension and a reluctant curiosity. He was a man who preferred the predictable rhythm of his days, the quiet companionship of the wind and the cattle. The arrival of another human soul, especially one carrying unknown burdens, was an unwelcome disruption. Yet here she was, a silhouette against the blazing sunset, an unknown entity about to step into the stark reality of his world. He took a deep breath, the dry air filling his lungs, and turned to walk back into the house, a hollow echo of Eleanor's voice whispering in his mind, "Ethan, we must always try to be kind." The wagon, pulled by 2 weary horses, rumbled to a halt in the dust just beyond the porch. The driver, a grizzled man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world's harshness, tipped his hat to Ethan, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding of solitude. He gestured towards the back of the wagon, where a figure sat hunched, shrouded in a travel-worn shawl. Ethan's gaze fixed on the woman, her form barely discernible in the deepening twilight. He recognized the signs of a long, arduous journey, the slumped shoulders, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to disappear from the world. The driver hopped down, his movements stiff and economical. "This is Sarah, mister," he announced, his voice raspy like stones grinding together. "Said she was sent by your cousin Jedediah. Said you'd be expecting her." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. He approached the wagon, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Welcome," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any warmth yet not overtly hostile. It was simply a statement of fact. The woman, Sarah, slowly unfolded herself from the wagon. She was younger than Ethan had anticipated, perhaps in her mid-20s, but her face, even in the dim light, held a weariness that belied her years. Her eyes, large and dark, were downcast, fixed on the ground, as if seeking solace in the dust. A stray strand of hair the color of dark wheat escaped from beneath her shawl and framed a face that was pale and drawn. She clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest, as if it were a shield. "Thank you for taking me in," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper, fragile as a moth's wing. It was a voice accustomed to being unheard. Ethan offered no immediate reply, simply stepping back to allow her to dismount. The driver, having completed his task, accepted the coins Ethan offered with a curt nod, and with a crack of his whip, turned his wagon and disappeared back into the encroaching darkness, leaving Ethan and Sarah in the vast, oppressive silence of the prairie. Sarah stood for a moment, a small lost figure against the imposing backdrop of the ranch house. It was larger than she had imagined, more solid, but no less lonely. Ethan watched her, his mind a blank canvas, trying to decipher the unspoken story etched on her features. He'd agreed to this out of a sense of obligation, a flicker of memory of Eleanor's pleas for kindness, but he was not a man accustomed to nurturing. His life was one of self-reliance, of weathering storms alone. He wasn't sure he had anything to offer this stranger, beyond a roof over her head and a place at his sparse table. "The house is simple," Ethan said, breaking the silence, the words sounding rough in his own ears. "There's a spare room. It's clean." He gestured towards the door. "Supper's ready if you're hungry. Just stew, nothing fancy." Sarah nodded again, her gaze still fixed on the ground. She followed him into the house, her steps tentative. The interior was as stark as the exterior, furnished with the essentials and little else. A rough-hewn table dominated the main room, flanked by sturdy chairs. A cast-iron stove glowed faintly, emitting a comforting warmth that did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of the stew. As they sat at the table, the silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Ethan served the stew, a hearty, unpretentious concoction of meat and root vegetables. Sarah ate mechanically, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each bite required conscious effort. Ethan watched her from beneath lowered lids, his gaze analytical, searching for something he couldn't quite name. He saw not just weariness, but a deep, profound sadness, a grief that seemed to cling to her like the prairie dust. "Jedediah mentioned you'd had some trouble," Ethan ventured, his voice still guarded, the words pulled from him like reluctant teeth. He regretted it the moment they left his lips. It was not his place to pry. Sarah's hand stilled midway to her mouth. Her dark eyes, when they finally met his, held a flicker of pain, quickly masked. "Trouble finds everyone, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice still soft but with a new undercurrent of resilience. "Some just carry it more visibly than others." Ethan inclined his head, a gesture that could have been agreement or dismissal. He recognized the veiled words, the carefully constructed defenses. He too knew the art of carrying one's burdens in silence. As the embers in the stove cast long shadows across the room, Ethan found himself studying the woman more intently. She was a mystery, a shadow that had entered his life unbidden, and he had an unsettling premonition that the dust of her arrival would take a long time to settle. The following days settled into a quiet, if somewhat strained, rhythm. Sarah proved to be a diligent and unobtrusive presence in Ethan's solitary world. She rose with the sun, her movements economical and purposeful. She helped with the mending of clothes, the cleaning of the house, and the preparation of meals. Her quiet efficiency, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions she seemed to hold within. Ethan observed her from a distance, a man accustomed to solitude now sharing his space with a ghost of unspoken sorrow. He found himself watching her as she moved about the house, her presence a subtle disturbance in the predictable order of his days. He learned little about her past. When he asked, her answers were polite but vague, deflecting any probing questions with a quiet grace that disarmed him. He knew her name, Sarah, and that she had arrived at Jedediah's request, but beyond that, she remained an enigma. Yet beneath the layers of her reserve, Ethan sensed a deep well of pain, a wound that had not yet begun to heal. He recognized the look in her eyes, the subtle tremor in her hands, when she thought no one was watching, the unmistakable signs of a grief that had left its indelible mark. One evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, the wind picking up its mournful howl, Sarah stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. Ethan entered the room, carrying a stack of firewood. He paused, observing her. Her shoulders were trembling, and for a moment he thought she might weep. "The weather's turning," he stated, his voice deliberately neutral, an attempt to break the oppressive atmosphere without intruding too deeply. Sarah turned, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "It reminds me of—" she began, then stopped, her voice catching. She took a deep, shaky breath. "It reminds me of home. The storms there, they were fierce." Ethan set the firewood down by the hearth. He understood the power of memories tied to the elements, the way a certain scent, a sound, or a sight could transport one back to a place of profound emotion. He himself found solace in the vastness of the prairie, yet it also served as a constant reminder of all he had lost. "We get our share of storms out here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You learn to weather them." Sarah offered a small, melancholic smile. "I suppose you do. Or you learn to find shelter." She turned back to the window, her gaze distant. "My home, and it's gone now. Everything I knew, everyone I loved." Her voice was barely audible above the rising wind. "There was a fire." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken tragedy. Ethan felt a jolt of sympathy, an unwelcome intrusion into his carefully guarded emotional landscape. He knew the destructive power of fire. He'd seen its work on Eleanor's face, the way it had consumed her spirit long before her body had finally surrendered. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate, a pale echo of the loss she must have felt. Sarah didn't respond, her gaze lost in the tempestuous sky. Ethan watched her, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He was a man of action, accustomed to mending fences, tending to livestock, and battling the elements. He was not equipped to mend broken hearts or soothe the wounds of profound loss, yet he felt a pull, a nascent instinct to offer comfort, a sentiment he hadn't experienced since Eleanor had been alive. The storm broke then, rain lashing against the windows, the thunder a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the house. Inside, the silence between Ethan and Sarah was different now, no longer just awkward, but charged with a shared understanding of sorrow. They were two solitary souls, brought together by circumstance, each carrying the invisible scars of their past. Ethan found himself wondering what else lay beneath Sarah's quiet demeanor, what other storms she had weathered, and what shelter she truly sought in this desolate corner of the world. He realized with a dawning sense of unease that her arrival was not just a disruption, it was the beginning of something. Uncertain. The days bled into weeks, and Sarah remained, her presence becoming a quiet fixture in the ranch house. Ethan found himself adjusting to her routines, to the soft murmur of her voice when she spoke, to the gentle click of her needle as she mended worn fabrics. She was a woman of quiet strength, her resilience a constant unspoken testament to her ability to endure. Yet, the shadow of her past lingered, a spectral presence that clung to her like the scent of smoke. He noticed her small habits, the way she would sometimes trace the rim of her empty teacup, her gaze distant, or the way she would occasionally pause, her hand instinctively going to her abdomen, a fleeting gesture quickly concealed. These small movements, so subtle yet so telling, spoke of a deep unspoken yearning, a void that no amount of work or distraction could fill. It was a yearning Ethan understood intimately. One afternoon, while they were working in the small garden patch behind the house, the sun beating down with its relentless intensity, Sarah paused, wiping sweat from her brow. She looked out at the vast, empty plains, her expression one of profound longing. "It's a beautiful land, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So vast, so full of promise." She turned to him, her dark eyes filled with an unserving sadness. "But sometimes it feels like a place that mocks you." Ethan stopped his weeding, his hands stilling in the soil. He knew what she meant. The land promised life, sustenance, and prosperity, yet it could also be unforgiving, a harsh mistress that demanded everything and offered little in return. He also knew the deeper, more personal barrenness she alluded to. "The land doesn't mock, Miss Sarah," he said, his voice rough, the words pulled from a place of long-buried pain. "It simply is. It's us who project our hopes and our disappointments onto it." Sarah looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was the first time he had spoken so directly about such matters. "You understand?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Ethan nodded, his gaze returning to the soil. "Eleanor, my wife, she loved this land. She saw the beauty, the potential. But the emptiness." He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. He saw Eleanor's face in his mind, her gentle hope slowly withering under the weight of their shared inability to conceive. The silence of their childless home had been a constant, agonizing reminder of their barrenness. Sarah watched him, her own pain momentarily eclipsed by a surge of empathy. She recognized the familiar ache, the hollow space where a child should have been. "It's a heavy burden to carry," she said softly. "The knowledge that you can't, that you won't." "It can break you," Ethan finished, his voice a low growl. He remembered the slow erosion of Eleanor's spirit, the way her laughter had faded, replaced by a quiet resignation that had ultimately consumed her. He had felt it too, a crushing sense of failure, a deep-seated inadequacy that had left him hollowed out. They stood in silence for a long moment, the unspoken truth hanging between them, the shared barrenness, the grief of unmet hopes, the phantom ache of children they would never know. It was a silent acknowledgement of a shared fate, a bond forged not of choice, but of circumstance and profound loss. The vast, indifferent prairie stretched out before them, a silent witness to their individual and collective griefs, a stark reminder of the promises life had failed to keep. The rhythm of the ranch, once a solitary drumbeat, now held a faint, hesitant second rhythm, the quiet cadence of Sarah's presence. Ethan found himself growing accustomed to her routines, to the soft sounds she made as she moved about the house. He still kept his emotional distance, his interactions with her polite and functional, but the sharp edges of his isolation had begun to soften, ever so slightly. He realized he hadn't thought of Eleanor's absence with quite the same raw intensity in days. One blustery afternoon, as Ethan was mending a section of fence near the north pasture, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the bruised, cloud-laden sky. The rider was a woman, her figure slight, but her posture determined. Ethan squinted, his brow furrowed in curiosity. It was unusual for anyone to venture out this far, especially a lone woman. As the rider drew closer, Ethan recognized the distinctive, though unfamiliar, dark mare. The woman's face, framed by dark hair escaping from beneath a wide-brimmed hat, was pale but resolute. She rode with a quiet grace, a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble cowboys Ethan was accustomed to seeing. When she finally reined in her horse a few yards from him, Ethan felt a prickle of apprehension. "Mr. Thorne?" she called out, her voice clear and carrying, though tinged with a weariness that mirrored Sarah's. Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "That's me. My name is Clara. I was told you might have work here for a woman, someone to help with the house, perhaps." She hesitated, her gaze flicking past him, towards the distant ranch house. "I've traveled a long way. I'm in need of a place." Ethan's mind immediately went to Sarah. He hadn't expected another woman. His small ranch, his solitary life, felt suddenly ill-equipped to accommodate two strangers, each carrying their own unspoken burdens. He exchanged a quick glance with Clara. Her eyes, a soft hazel, held a deep sadness, a quiet desperation that resonated with a familiar chord within him. He saw in them the same guardedness, the same carefully constructed facade that Sarah presented. "Work?" Ethan repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. He hadn't considered hiring anyone, let alone another woman. His mind, accustomed to the predictable, was struggling to adapt to this unexpected turn of events. "I'm a good worker," Clara added quickly, her voice earnest. I can cook, clean, sew. I'm not afraid of hard work. She clutched the reins tightly, her knuckles white. I'm in a difficult situation. I have nowhere else to go. Ethan felt a familiar tug of obligation, a ghost of Eleanor's compassion stirring within him. He looked at Clara, at the hopeful yet anxious expression on her face, and then his thoughts drifted to Sarah, alone in the house. He remembered the silent grief he'd glimpsed in her eyes, the unspoken emptiness. He couldn't imagine adding another soul to that unspoken understanding, another woman carrying a similar burden. I already have someone helping me, Ethan stated, his voice carefully neutral. A woman named Sarah. Clara's face fell, a flicker of disappointment crossing her features, quickly replaced by a forced composure. Oh, I see. She seemed to shrink slightly in her saddle. I understand. Ethan hesitated. He could send her away, back into the unforgiving landscape from which she had come. But something in her quiet demeanor, in the way her eyes pleaded without words, stopped him. He thought of Eleanor, her gentle spirit, her unwavering kindness. He thought of Sarah and the unspoken sadness that permeated her presence. Wait here, Ethan said, the words surprising even himself. He turned and walked back towards the ranch house, his mind racing. He needed to speak with Sarah. He needed to gauge her reaction, to see if she too felt the weight of this unexpected arrival. As he walked, the wind whispered secrets through the tall grasses, carrying with it the promise of change and the unsettling premonition that his life, once so starkly defined by solitude, was about to become infinitely more complex. Ethan found Sarah in the kitchen, meticulously polishing a silver locket, her brow furrowed in concentration. The small reflective surface seemed to hold her captive, drawing her gaze into its depths. When he entered, she looked up, her expression mild curiosity. "There's a rider out by the north pasture," Ethan said, getting straight to the point. He watched her reaction, searching for any flicker of surprise or unease. Her expression remained placid, her hands stilling on the locket. "A rider?" she inquired, her voice calm. "A woman. Says her name is Clara. She's looking for work. Said she was sent to inquire about a position helping with the house." Sarah's dark eyes met his. There was a subtle shift in her gaze, a quiet awareness that seemed to acknowledge the unspoken. She didn't voice any objections, but Ethan sensed a subtle tension enter the room, a silent acknowledgement of the delicate balance that had been established between them. "She sounds in need," Sarah said after a moment, her voice soft. She returned her attention to the locket, her fingers tracing its smooth surface. "You said she was looking for work here?" "Yes, said she's a good worker. Cook, clean, sew." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He was waiting for her reaction, for some indication of how this news might affect her. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the locket. Ethan could almost feel the wheels turning in her mind, the quiet calculation of how this new presence would alter their already fragile dynamic. He wondered if she felt threatened, or perhaps if she saw another soul adrift, much like herself. "It's a large house, Mr. Thorne," Sarah finally said, her voice measured. "There's always work to be done, and perhaps it would be good to have another hand, especially if she's as capable as she sounds." She looked up at him, her dark eyes steady. "It's been quiet, mostly." Her words were carefully chosen, polite and agreeable, yet beneath the surface Ethan sensed a complexity he couldn't fully decipher. Was this genuine acceptance or a calculated move to maintain her own precarious position? He couldn't be sure. He knew Sarah was not one to outwardly express her emotions, but he also knew the isolation of this place, the profound loneliness that could drive people to seek any form of companionship, even a shared silence. He nodded, a decision made. "All right, I'll tell her to come up." He paused, then added, "You don't seem bothered." Sarah offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Bothered? No, Mr. Thorne. Just observant. And perhaps hopeful." She looked down at the locket again. "Sometimes another presence can make the quiet less deafening." Ethan left the kitchen, the unspoken understanding between them hanging in the air. He walked back out to Clara, who waited patiently by her horse, her hopeful expression tinged with apprehension. "You can stay," Ethan said, his voice gruff. "Sarah could use the help. There's a small room in the back. It's not much, but it's dry." Clara's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne, thank you so much." Her voice trembled slightly. As Clara led her horse towards the house, Ethan watched her, a sense of foreboding mingling with a strange, reluctant acceptance. Two women, both carrying the weight of unspoken grief, now shared his solitude. The quiet order of his life had been irrevocably disrupted, and he had a chilling premonition that the dust once settled was about to be stirred up once more, revealing layers of emotion and complexity he had long tried to bury. Clara settled into her new surroundings with a quiet efficiency that mirrored Sarah's. The spare room, small and sparsely furnished, became her sanctuary. She was a woman of few words, her past as veiled as Sarah's, her resilience forged in a similar crucible of hardship. Ethan observed them both, two women adrift in the vastness of his ranch, their shared silence a tangible presence in the house. He found himself watching them interact, a subtle understanding passing between them, a communication that transcended words. They rarely spoke of their pasts, their conversations revolving around the daily tasks of the ranch, yet a deeper connection seemed to bind them. One evening, as the three of them sat around the table for supper, the conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences. Ethan, usually content in his own quietude, found himself increasingly aware of the unspoken emotions swirling around him. He noticed the way Sarah's gaze would sometimes drift towards Clara, a look of quiet empathy in her eyes, and the way Clara would offer Sarah a gentle, reassuring smile. It was a silent acknowledgement of their shared plight, a silent understanding of the barrenness that shadowed their lives. After supper, as Ethan was clearing the table, he overheard Sarah and Clara talking in low tones in the sitting room. He paused, catching snippets of their hushed conversation. "It's the quiet that gets to you most," Sarah was saying, her voice soft. "The silence where you expect, where you long for." "I know," Clara replied, her voice equally hushed. "The dreams, they can be so vivid. And then waking up, that's the hardest part." Ethan's hand froze on a plate. Dreams. He knew about dreams. He still dreamt of Eleanor, of their shared hopes, of the child they had never held. He knew the sharp, piercing pain of waking to the stark reality of his empty home. He continued his work, but the words echoed in his mind. He realized that beneath Sarah's quiet stoicism and Clara's gentle demeanor lay a shared agony, a profound yearning for what they could not have. He saw them not just as helpers, but as women carrying a deep, unspoken sorrow, a barrenness that defined their existence. Later that night, as he lay in his bed, the wind howling a mournful lullaby outside, Ethan found himself contemplating the two women sharing his home. He had taken them in out of a sense of obligation, a flicker of Eleanor's compassion, but he was beginning to understand that their presence was more than just a practical arrangement. They were two souls adrift, seeking refuge not just from external hardships, but from the internal landscape of their own grief. He thought of Sarah's quiet grace and Clara's gentle strength, and the unspoken understanding that had bloomed between them. He wondered if, in their shared barrenness, they had found a strange form of solace, a companionship born of mutual understanding. He also wondered about the silent rancher, himself a man whose heart had been long dormant, and how these two women, with their quiet resilience and their unspoken yearnings, were slowly, subtly, beginning to stir the embers of his own buried emotions. The dust of their arrival was far from settled. It was, he suspected, just beginning to swirl. The days continued their unhurried march across the vast prairie. Ethan, Sarah, and Clara established a working routine. Sarah managed the household, Clara assisted her, and Ethan managed the ranch. Their interactions were polite, functional, marked by a shared understanding of unspoken boundaries. Yet, beneath the surface of their quiet coexistence, subtle currents of emotion began to stir. Ethan noticed the small ways Sarah and Clara supported each other. When Sarah's gaze grew distant, lost in a memory, Clara would gently steer the conversation back to the present. When Clara seemed overwhelmed by a task, Sarah would offer a quiet word of encouragement or a helping hand. It was a silent camaraderie, a bond forged in shared vulnerability and unspoken grief. One afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line, Sarah paused, her hand instinctively going to her abdomen. She closed her eyes for a moment, a faint tremor running through her. Clara, who was sorting clothes nearby, noticed. She approached Sarah, her expression one of quiet concern. "Are you all right, Sarah?" Clara asked softly. Sarah opened her eyes, a faint melancholic smile touching her lips. "Just a moment, Clara. The wind here sometimes makes me feel hollow. She looked out at the endless expanse of the prairie. It's so full of life, this land. And yet, for some of us, she trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of her longing. Clara nodded, her gaze mirroring Sarah's. I understand. Sometimes I look at the sky and I imagine a nursery filled with laughter. And then I remember. Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with unshed tears. Ethan, who had been observing from a distance, felt a familiar ache in his chest. He recognized the painful sting of unmet expectations, the crushing weight of a future that would never come to pass. He had witnessed Eleanor's quiet despair, her slow surrender to the barrenness of their lives. He saw the same potential for heartbreak in these two women. It's not the land's fault, Ethan said, his voice rough, stepping closer. He rarely offered unsolicited comfort, but the raw pain in their eyes had moved him. The land, it just provides. It doesn't judge. Sarah and Clara looked at him, surprised by his intervention. There was a vulnerability in their shared gaze that spoke volumes. They were women who had been denied the fundamental experience of motherhood, a deeply ingrained expectation of womanhood, and the absence of it cast a long, dark shadow over their lives. It's hard, Mr. Thorne, Clara said, her voice trembling, when everyone expects, when you want so desperately, and it never happens. It's a different kind of ache, Sarah added softly, a silence that echoes louder than any sound. Ethan nodded, the words resonating deeply within him. He understood the profound grief of a future that would never be, the phantom limbs of children never held. He had seen Eleanor's spirit slowly extinguished by this very sorrow. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this unspoken barrenness was the unspoken tragedy that bound these two women together, and now it was a quiet undercurrent in his own life as well. The weight of those unfulfilled expectations was a heavy burden, and he had a growing fear that it would crush them all. The days on Ethan's ranch unfolded with a deceptive tranquility, a placid surface that masked the subtle shifts occurring beneath. Sarah and Clara, two women bound by the unspoken grief of infertility, had found a tentative rhythm in their shared existence with Ethan. Their interactions were marked by a quiet understanding, a language of glances and soft gestures that spoke volumes about their shared journey. Ethan, a man accustomed to the stark solitude of his own grief, found himself observing them with a curiosity that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. He noticed the small, almost imperceptible ways their presence had begun to alter the atmosphere of the ranch house. Laughter, once a forgotten melody, occasionally punctuated the silence. Sarah, who had arrived cloaked in an almost impenetrable reserve, now sometimes offered a shy smile, a flicker of warmth in her dark eyes. Clara, whose initial demeanor had been one of quiet apprehension, now moved with a greater sense of ease, her presence radiating a gentle strength. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the prairie, Ethan found Sarah and Clara sitting by the hearth mending clothes. The firelight cast a warm glow on their faces, softening the lines etched by unspoken sorrow. They weren't speaking, but the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating silence that had once defined Ethan's home. Ethan entered the room, a stack of firewood in his arms. He paused, observing them. He saw not just two women helping him, but two souls, finding solace in each other's company, two individuals navigating the painful landscape of their childless lives together. "Storm's coming," Ethan stated, his voice a low rumble, breaking the comfortable silence. Sarah looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "It feels like it," she said softly. "A big one by the looks of it." Clara nodded, her gaze shifting towards the window where the wind was beginning to whip the tall grasses. "We should bring in the extra wood from the porch." As they moved to prepare for the storm, Ethan noticed a subtle shift in his own feelings. The gnawing emptiness that had long been his constant companion seemed to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of connection. It was a fragile connection, built on the shared understanding of loss, but it was there, a nascent sprout pushing through the hardened earth of his heart. He found himself watching Sarah as she moved with her usual quiet efficiency, and Clara as she offered a reassuring smile. He realized that their shared barrenness, the very source of their unspoken pain, had also become the foundation of their quiet bond. And in their shared vulnerability, They were slowly, irrevocably beginning to chip away at the walls he had built around his own heart. The dust of their arrival was not just settling, it was being stirred, revealing the contours of a landscape far more complex and emotional than he had ever anticipated. The silent rancher was no longer entirely alone. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke with a fury that shook the very foundations of the ranch house. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and the wind howled like a wounded beast, its mournful cry amplified by the thunder that rolled across the prairie. Inside, the flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows, creating an atmosphere of forced intimacy. Ethan, Sarah, and Clara found themselves confined to the main room, the storm outside a tangible barrier that kept them together. The initial camaraderie that had begun to bloom between the two women seemed to falter slightly, under the pressure of the prolonged proximity. While they still offered each other quiet support, Ethan sensed a new undercurrent of unease, a subtle tension that hadn't been present before. He watched them covertly as they went about their evening tasks, their movements a little more hesitant, their smiles a little less frequent. Sarah, usually so composed, found her gaze drifting towards the window more often, her expression clouded with a familiar sadness. The storm seemed to stir the ghosts of her past, the memories of the fire, of the life she had lost, resurfacing with a painful clarity. Ethan saw the way her hand would sometimes flutter towards her abdomen, a gesture so quick he almost missed it, a phantom touch seeking an echo of a life that would never be. Clara, too, seemed affected by the tempestuous weather. Her usual gentle resilience appeared to be tested. Her eyes, usually so full of quiet hope, held a new fragility, a vulnerability that spoke of deeper anxieties. Ethan noticed her watching Sarah, a look of profound empathy in her hazel eyes, as if she could feel the echoes of Sarah's pain as her own. Ethan, caught between the two women, felt a growing disquiet. He was a man who preferred clarity, who found comfort in the predictable rhythms of his solitary life. This burgeoning emotional landscape, with its unspoken tensions and subtle anxieties, was foreign territory. He had taken them in out of a sense of duty, a flicker of Eleanor's compassion, but he was beginning to feel like an unwilling spectator to a drama he didn't fully understand. During a lull in the thunder, Clara spoke, her voice soft, yet carrying in the charged atmosphere. "It's times like these, when everything feels so uncertain. You're shut in, and all the things you try to outrun, they find you." She glanced at Sarah, a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. The quiet outside, it amplifies the quiet inside. Her voice was barely a whisper, the quiet where you expect the sounds of life. Ethan felt a prickle of unease. He recognized the sentiment. He too had wrestled with the deafening silence of his home after Eleanor had left, the silence that screamed of everything that was missing. He understood the desperate yearning for the sounds of life, for the laughter of children, for the gentle patter of small feet. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the hushed room. "The storm will pass," he said, his voice devoid of any particular emotion, yet carrying an implicit reassurance. "It always does." Clara offered a faint smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I suppose so," she murmured. "But some storms leave a different kind of mark, don't they?" Ethan didn't answer. He watched the two women, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their shared sorrow a palpable entity in the room. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, a dawning awareness that his solitary existence had become intertwined with theirs. The seeds of disquiet had been sown, and he had a chilling premonition that they would soon begin to sprout. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a landscape that glistened under the returning sun. The forced intimacy of the previous night dissipated with the retreating thunder, replaced by a return to their established routines. Yet the subtle shifts in atmosphere persisted. Ethan noticed a new dynamic emerging between Sarah and Clara, a quiet undercurrent of unspoken rivalry that was as unsettling as it was undeniable. It wasn't overt. There were no sharp words, no open confrontations. Instead, it manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways. A lingering glance, a subtle competition for Ethan's attention, a heightened awareness of each other's presence. Sarah, who had initially welcomed Clara's arrival as a shared respite from the loneliness, now seemed more guarded, her natural reserve deepening. Clara, too, appeared more watchful, her gentle demeanor occasionally tinged with an almost imperceptible defensiveness. Ethan, a man acutely aware of the subtle cues in animal behavior, recognized the signs of unspoken competition. He saw it in the way Sarah would ensure their meals were impeccably prepared, her culinary skills showcased with a quiet pride, and in the way Clara would volunteer for tasks that brought her into closer contact with Ethan, offering him a steady, supportive presence as he worked. One afternoon, while Ethan was tending to a sick calf, both Sarah and Clara appeared at the corral, ostensibly to offer help. Sarah, with her steady hands, offered to fetch water and blankets, her movements efficient and reassuring. Clara, with a gentle touch, soothed the distressed animal, her voice a soft murmur that seemed to calm its fear. Ethan found himself caught between them, acutely aware of the unspoken contest for his notice. "The calf seems a bit stronger," Ethan commented, his voice neutral, as he adjusted the calf's bandages. Sarah offered a soft smile. "I'm glad. I've been worried about him." Clara nodded, her gaze steady. "He's a fighter. He'll pull through." There was a moment of silence, charged with an unspoken tension. Ethan felt a growing discomfort. He hadn't sought this attention, this subtle rivalry, and he didn't know how to navigate it. He was a rancher, not a diplomat. His life had been one of simple, direct interactions, and this complex dance of feminine emotions was beyond his usual understanding. Later that evening, as Ethan sat on the porch cleaning his rifle, he saw Sarah and Clara emerge from the house. They stood for a moment, silhouetted against the lamplight, their expressions unreadable. Then Sarah turned and walked towards the corrals, while Clara headed towards the far end of the porch, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. They had, in their own quiet way, separated themselves, creating a physical distance that mirrored the growing emotional one. Ethan sighed, the sound barely audible above the chirping of crickets. He understood the desperation that drove them, the deep-seated longing for connection, for affection, for a sense of belonging. He knew that their shared barrenness, while initially a source of silent solidarity, was now a catalyst for a different kind of yearning. A yearning for a love, a family, a future that might still be possible, even without children. He was caught in the middle of it, a silent observer of their subtle struggles, and he feared that these unspoken rivalries, if left unchecked, could unravel the fragile peace he had so unintentionally fostered. The unspoken rivalries continued to simmer beneath the surface of their daily lives, creating an atmosphere of subtle tension. Ethan, though outwardly stoic, found himself increasingly aware of the shifting dynamics between Sarah and Clara. He observed their interactions, noting the fleeting glances, the carefully chosen words, and the way their focus often seemed to drift towards him, seeking his approval or his notice. One sweltering afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a windmill, he noticed Clara sitting on the porch swing, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling. She was alone, and the quiet sobs that escaped her were almost lost in the vastness of the prairie. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his ingrained instinct for self-preservation warring with a nascent sense of concern. He approached her slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Clara?" he said, his voice a low rumble. She started, quickly wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her face was pale, and her hazel eyes were red-rimmed. "Mr. Thorne," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. I didn't see you there." Ethan stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to proceed. He wasn't accustomed to offering comfort, especially not to women. His emotional landscape was as stark and unforgiving as the prairie itself. "Are you all right?" he asked, the question feeling inadequate. Clara shook her head, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "No," she whispered. "Not really." She clutched her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "It's just, sometimes, the quiet, the memories, they come back so strong." Ethan nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He knew the power of those memories, the way they could resurface without warning, shattering the carefully constructed peace. He thought of Eleanor, her gentle spirit slowly eroded by the weight of their shared grief. "It's hard," he said, the words feeling insufficient, yet all he could offer. Clara looked at him, her gaze vulnerable and searching. I thought I was strong enough, that I could leave it all behind. But it follows you, doesn't it? The emptiness." Ethan met her gaze, his own eyes, usually so guarded, betraying a flicker of his own pain. "Some things leave a mark that never fades," he admitted, the words torn from him like a reluctant confession. He saw in Clara's eyes a reflection of his own buried grief, a shared understanding of loss that transcended their individual circumstances. He didn't try to offer platitudes or easy comfort. He simply stood there, a silent, solid presence, acknowledging her pain without attempting to diminish it. For a long moment, they simply stood in the quiet, the vastness of the prairie surrounding them, two solitary souls bound by a shared understanding of heartache. It was a fragile moment, a brief glimpse into the depths of Clara's vulnerability, and it stirred something within Ethan, a faint echo of the compassion he thought had long since withered and died within him. The days on the ranch began to take on a new, subtle rhythm. Ethan, Sarah, and Clara continued their daily routines, but an unspoken understanding seemed to have settled between them. The burgeoning rivalries had receded, replaced by a quiet, almost melancholic solidarity. Ethan found himself increasingly drawn into their orbits, his solitary existence slowly being softened by their shared presence. One evening, as dusk settled over the prairie, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan found Sarah and Clara sitting together on the porch, sharing a pot of tea. They weren't speaking, but their proximity was one of quiet companionship. He joined them, a rare gesture of ease that surprised even himself. As they sat in comfortable silence, Ethan noticed Sarah reach into her pocket and pull out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. She turned it over in her fingers, her gaze distant. Clara watched her, her expression one of understanding. "My mother carved this," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible above the chirping of crickets. "She always said it was a symbol of hope, that even when things seemed darkest, there was always a song waiting to be sung." She ran a thumb over the smooth wood. I lost her years ago, and with her, much of the hope she represented." Clara reached out and gently touched Sarah's hand. "It's beautiful, Sarah, a true treasure." Her gaze shifted to Ethan. "We all carry such treasures, don't we? Things that remind us of what we've lost and what we still hope for." Ethan felt a stirring within him, a resonance with their words. He thought of Eleanor, of the locket she always wore, a small silver heart that held a miniature portrait of their unborn child. It was a treasure he kept hidden, a painful reminder of a love and a future that had been cruelly snatched away. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough, then stopped, clearing his throat. "My wife, she had a locket. It held a picture." He couldn't bring himself to say more, the memory too raw, too painful. Sarah and Clara exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the shared pain. They understood. They understood the weight of memory, the enduring power of love, even in the face of loss. "It's important to hold on to those things," Clara said softly, her gaze steady. "They're proof that we loved, that we lived." Sarah nodded, carefully placing the wooden bird back into her pocket. "And sometimes," she added, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "they remind us that we can find hope again, even in the quietest places." In that moment, under the vast star-dusted sky, a new understanding seemed to settle between the three of them. The unspoken grief that had initially isolated them had, in a strange and unexpected way, become the foundation of their connection. They were no longer just strangers sharing a roof. They were individuals who understood the profound weight of loss, and in that shared understanding they found a fragile, nascent form of hope. The secrets they held, once buried deep within their hearts, were now beginning to surface, woven together by the threads of their shared vulnerability. As the weeks wore on, the fragile peace on the ranch began to fray, subtly at first, like a worn thread on a favorite shirt. Ethan, Sarah, and Clara had found a semblance of harmony, their shared experience of loss creating a quiet understanding between them. However, the underlying currents of yearning and unspoken desires began to surface once more, casting shadows of doubt over their carefully constructed equilibrium. Ethan noticed a subtle shift in Sarah's demeanor. The shy smiles and moments of quiet warmth had become less frequent, replaced by a return to her earlier reserve. Her gaze, once filled with a gentle acceptance, now held a flicker of something else, a quiet determination, a burgeoning ambition that seemed to set her apart. She began to take on more responsibilities, her efficiency bordering on relentless, as if driven by an unseen urgency. Clara, too, seemed more restless. Her gentle support for Sarah was still present, but it was now tinged with a growing anxiety. Ethan observed her watching Sarah, her hazel eyes filled with a complex mixture of concern and something akin to apprehension. He sensed that Clara felt a growing unease about the direction things were heading, a premonition that the fragile peace they had found was about to be disrupted. One afternoon, while Ethan was overseeing the branding of new calves, Sarah approached him, her expression serious. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady, "I've been thinking about the ranch. It's a substantial operation, and with the herd growing—" Ethan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's a lot of work, yes." "I believe I could take on more," Sarah continued, her gaze direct. "I've been observing, learning. I'm efficient, I'm organized. I could manage the accounts, handle the supplies, free up more of your time for the cattle." Ethan felt a jolt of surprise. Sarah, who had arrived seeking refuge, was now talking about taking on more responsibility, about managing the business side of the ranch. It was a significant shift from her initial quiet demeanor. He knew she was intelligent and capable, but this ambition felt unexpected. Clara, who had been nearby tending to some tools, overheard their conversation. She paused, her hands stilling, a shadow crossing her face. She walked over, her expression a careful mask of polite interest. "That's a very generous offer, Sarah," Clara said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying tension Ethan couldn't ignore. "The accounts can be quite complex." Sarah met Clara's gaze, a subtle challenge in her eyes. "I believe I can handle them. I'm a quick study." Ethan felt a prickle of unease. The subtle rivalries he had observed earlier seemed to be resurfacing, taking on a new form. This wasn't about his attention anymore. It was about influence, about position. He looked from Sarah's determined expression to Clara's guarded one, and he realized that their shared grief, while a powerful unifier, was also a potent catalyst for their individual desires. He had inadvertently created an environment where their yearning for a future, for purpose, was beginning to manifest in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he feared that these growing ambitions could lead to unforeseen conflicts. The subtle shifts in the ranch's atmosphere intensified. Sarah's ambition to manage the ranch's accounts became a quiet but persistent presence, and Ethan found himself increasingly drawn into discussions about the ranch's operations. He was surprised by her keen understanding of the business, her sharp mind for numbers and logistics. It was clear she had a hidden depth, a capacity for leadership he hadn't initially recognized. Clara, however, seemed to retreat further into herself. While she still performed her duties diligently, the light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a quiet melancholy. Ethan noticed her spending more time alone, gazing out at the prairie, her expression lost in thought. He suspected her anxieties were growing, fueled by Sarah's increasing prominence and her own unspoken fears. One afternoon, while Ethan was repairing a fence near the eastern boundary, he saw Clara sitting by a lone, wind-battered cottonwood tree, her shoulders hunched against the vastness of the landscape. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Clara," he called out softly. She started, her eyes widening slightly. "Mr. Thorne," she murmured, quickly wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his gaze taking in her tear-streaked face. "You all right?" he asked, the question habitual yet carrying a deeper resonance. She shook her head, a small broken sound escaping her lips. I was just thinking about what might have been." Her voice trembled. "My husband, he always wanted to expand the ranch, to build something lasting, but we never had the chance." She looked out at the endless horizon, her gaze filled with a profound sadness. "And then, after he was gone, the thought of children, it wasn't meant to be." Ethan listened, his own past experiences of loss and unfulfilled dreams resonating with her words. He knew the sting of what might have been, the painful contrast between the life envisioned and the life lived. "He would have been proud of you, Clara," Ethan said, the words surprising him as they left his lips. He saw the genuine pain in her eyes, the lingering echo of a love lost, and the quiet ache of a future that would never be. Clara looked at him, her hazel eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she whispered. It means a lot." She turned back to the horizon, a fragile smile touching her lips. "Sometimes, just remembering is all you have left." As Ethan watched her, a realization dawned upon him. Sarah's ambition, her drive to manage the ranch, was a manifestation of her own buried desires, her yearning for purpose and control in a life that had offered her so little. Clara's quiet melancholy stemmed from her own lost dreams, her own unfulfilled maternal longings. He was not just sheltering two women, he was bearing witness to their individual struggles, their quiet battles against the ghosts of their past and the uncertainties of their future. The whispers of their pasts once buried were now beginning to surface, shaping the present and casting long shadows over the path ahead. The air on the ranch grew heavy with unspoken emotions. Sarah's assertiveness in managing the ranch affairs continued to grow, a determined gleam in her dark eyes. She was efficient, organized, and her proposals for improving the ranch's operations were sound. Ethan found himself relying on her more and more, impressed by her acumen and her quiet drive. Clara, meanwhile, seemed to withdraw further into herself. Her days were marked by a quiet sadness, her once gentle demeanor now tinged with a profound melancholy. She still performed her duties, but her heart no longer seemed fully invested. Ethan noticed her stealing glances at Sarah, her hazel eyes filled with a complex mixture of admiration and a quiet, gnawing envy. He sensed that Clara felt increasingly overshadowed, her own quiet strength overshadowed by Sarah's burgeoning ambition. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan was inspecting a section of fence near the western boundary when he heard raised voices coming from the direction of the house. He recognized Sarah's determined tone, but it was Clara's voice, usually so soft, that held an unusual edge of desperation. He hurried back, a sense of foreboding settling in his gut. He found them in the main room, their faces flushed, their eyes locked in a silent battle. Sarah stood by the ledger, her posture defensive, while Clara faced her, her hands clenched at her sides. "You can't just make these decisions on your own, Sarah," Clara exclaimed, her voice trembling. "This is Mr. Thorne's ranch. His legacy." Sarah turned, her dark eyes flashing. "And who is going to ensure that legacy thrives, Clara? You, who spends your days staring at the horizon. I'm the one with the head for business. I'm the one who can make this ranch profitable." "Profitable? Is that all you care about?" Clara retorted, her voice rising. "What about loyalty? What about what's right?" Ethan stepped forward, his presence commanding their attention. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. Sarah immediately softened, her expression shifting to one of deference. "Nothing, Mr. Thorne. Just a slight disagreement about the new fencing plans." Clara, however, looked directly at Ethan, her eyes filled with a raw emotion. "It's more than that, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice cracking. "Sarah, she's making changes, big ones, without your full input. She's trying to take over." Sarah scoffed. "That's ridiculous, Clara. I'm simply trying to ensure the ranch's future, something you seem incapable of considering." Ethan looked from one woman to the other, sensing the deeper currents of their conflict. It wasn't just about the ranch. It was about their individual desires, their unspoken yearnings, and their perceived places in his life. He saw the raw ambition in Sarah's eyes and the desperate plea for recognition in Clara's. He realized that the shared burden of their infertility had not erased their individual needs and desires. It had in some ways amplified them, pushing them to seek fulfillment in different ways. The unveiling of these deeper emotions, the raw exposure of their unspoken conflicts, was both a relief and a source of growing concern. The confrontation between Sarah and Clara left an undeniable tension hanging in the air. Ethan, caught in the middle, felt a growing unease. He recognized that their conflict stemmed not only from their differing approaches to managing the ranch, but also from their unspoken competition for a sense of purpose and belonging. He knew he had to address the underlying issues, the deep-seated yearnings that were surfacing with increasing intensity. He found Sarah in the barn, meticulously cleaning tack, her movements sharp and precise. He approached her, his presence a quiet disruption to her focused activity. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady, "about what Clara said." Sarah looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. Her usual deference was still there, but it was tempered by a quiet resolve. "Clara is overly emotional, Mr. Thorne. She's letting her personal feelings cloud her judgment." "And yours?" Ethan asked, his gaze unwavering. "Are yours clear?" Sarah paused, then set down the bridle she was holding. "I believe in this ranch, Mr. Thorne. I see its potential. I want to see it thrive. It's something I can build, something I can control. She looked away, her voice dropping. Something I can make mine. Ethan understood. Her ambition was a shield, a way to carve out a sense of purpose in a life that had offered her so little agency. He also knew that her desire for control was deeply intertwined with her unspoken grief, her yearning for a future that had been denied her. He then sought out Clara, finding her sitting alone on the porch, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Her usual quiet sadness was now tinged with a palpable sense of defeat. "Clara," Ethan said, sitting beside her, a rare gesture of intimacy. She looked at him, her hazel eyes filled with unshed tears. "She's right, isn't she, Mr. Thorne? About me, about not being able to build anything." "You have strength, Clara," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "A quiet strength that's just as valuable. You offer comfort, a different kind of support." He knew he was treading on delicate ground, navigating the complex emotions of two women who had come to rely on his presence, his stability. Clara turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not enough, is it? Not when Sarah, she's so capable, so driven." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. I wish I could have given you a family, a future." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. The unspoken truth, the very core of their shared existence, had finally been laid bare. He too had longed for a family, for children. His infertility had been a silent, devastating blow, a source of profound grief that had shaped his entire life. He looked at Clara, at Sarah, and he saw the echoes of his own unfulfilled dreams reflected in their eyes. The weight of their shared truth, the unspoken barrenness that bound them, was a heavy burden, and he knew that a choice, a heartbreaking choice, was fast approaching. The confrontation, though painful, had brought a measure of clarity to the ranch. The unspoken tensions had surfaced, and Ethan found himself with a clearer understanding of Sarah's ambition and Clara's quiet despair. He recognized that their individual yearnings were deeply rooted in their shared experience of infertility, their desperate need for purpose and fulfillment in a life that had promised so much and delivered so little. Sarah, emboldened by Ethan's implicit acceptance of her managerial abilities, continued to assert her influence on the ranch. Her proposals for expansion and improved efficiency were practical and well-considered, and Ethan found himself increasingly relying on her sharp business sense. There was a new confidence in her demeanor, a quiet pride in her ability to contribute in such a meaningful way. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to accept her new role with a quiet resignation. The desperate yearning for a maternal future, so palpable before, had softened, replaced by a gentle acceptance of her present circumstances. She continued to provide a steady, comforting presence, her quiet strength a balm to the ranch's underlying anxieties. Ethan noticed that her interactions with Sarah, while still marked by a subtle awareness, were no longer tinged with envy. Instead, there was a growing respect, a quiet acknowledgement of each other's strengths. One afternoon, Ethan found Sarah and Clara working together in the kitchen, preparing a large meal. The atmosphere was different now, more harmonious. Sarah was directing the preparation with her usual efficiency, while Clara, with her gentle touch, was arranging the food with an artistic flair. "This looks wonderful," Ethan said, entering the kitchen, a rare smile touching his lips. Sarah beamed, her dark eyes shining. "We're trying something new, Mr. Thorne. A new recipe I found." Clara offered a soft smile. "It's a dish Sarah's mother used to make," she said. Sarah nodded, a flicker of nostalgia in her eyes. "Yes, she was a wonderful cook. She always said that good food could mend almost anything." Ethan watched them, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He saw not just two women, but two souls who had found a way to navigate their shared sorrow, to create something positive from the ashes of their unfulfilled dreams. He realized that the turning tide on the ranch wasn't just about business or new recipes. It was about finding new pathways to fulfillment, new ways to build a life, even in the face of profound loss. The ranch, once a monument to his solitude, was slowly transforming into a space where shared dreams, though different from the ones he had once envisioned, could begin to take root. The heartbreaking choice he believed he couldn't escape was perhaps not about choosing one woman over the other, but about embracing the unexpected tapestry of connection and purpose that had unfolded before him. The unforgiving sun beat down on the dusty plains, a relentless reminder of the arid landscape that defined their lives. Inside the main house of the Double R Ranch, a tension thicker than the summer heat hung in the air. Sarah, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, watched as Jedediah studied a worn map spread across the oak table. His silence was a heavy cloak, muffling the unspoken anxieties that had begun to fester between them. "Jedediah," she began, her voice soft but edged with a plea, "we need to talk about the new foreman. Martha says he's been asking too many questions about the north pasture." Jedediah's gaze remained fixed on the map, his brow furrowed. He traced a line with a calloused finger, his movements slow and deliberate. "Questions are his job, Sarah, that's why we hired him. But these aren't about fences or branding. They're about the old well, the one near the abandoned claim." Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. The mention of the well, a place she tried to keep buried in her past, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a relic of a life she'd tried to escape, a life she'd hoped to leave behind in the dust of her former home. He finally looked up, his steely blue eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Caution, perhaps, or a weariness of his own. "What kind of questions?" "About who last used it, about why it was sealed up. He mentioned hearing stories." Sarah's voice faltered. She hated that Martha, her loyal, gossipy housekeeper, was the source of this unease. But Martha had an uncanny knack for overhearing things, for piecing together fragments of hushed conversations. Jedediah sighed, a sound of deep frustration. He pushed the map away, the scraping of paper against wood loud in the oppressive quiet. "Stories are just that, Sarah. Stories. This land has a history, and folks like to fill the gaps with their imaginations. He's new. He's trying to understand the ranch. That includes its peculiarities." "Peculiarities?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "Jedediah, it's more than peculiar. It's a wound that hasn't healed. And if he starts digging around, if he finds what's in that old mine shaft—" She trailed off, the image of what lay hidden in the darkness, what she had desperately tried to conceal, flashing through her mind. The thought of it being unearthed, of her past colliding with her present, was a terrifying prospect. "He won't find anything," Jedediah said, his tone firm, almost dismissive. "I made sure of that. The shaft is collapsed, sealed tight. No one can get in and nothing can get out." He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "I'll speak with him myself, put his mind at ease." But Sarah saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened. He was as worried as she was, perhaps more so. The new foreman, a man named Silas, was a stranger, a man with an unnerving stare and a quiet persistence that Sarah found increasingly unsettling. He moved through the ranch like a shadow, his presence a subtle but constant disruption. She had seen him watching the house, his gaze lingering a moment too long on the windows. She had seen him talking to the hands, his voice low, his gestures animated. What was he saying? What was he stirring up? Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sarah stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. She watched Silas ride back from the north pasture, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. As he passed the house, his eyes met hers. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a cool, appraising look that made her skin crawl. He offered a curt nod, then turned and disappeared into the bunkhouse. Sarah shivered, despite the mild evening. The silence of the ranch, once a source of solace, now felt charged with unspoken threats. The carefully constructed peace she and Jedediah had built, the fragile sanctuary they had created, felt as if it were beginning to crumble, undermined by whispers and shadows from the past. The fear that had been a dull ache for so long was sharpening, becoming a keen cutting edge. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Silas was not just asking questions about the land, he was asking questions about them. And she feared more than anything what he might uncover, the old well, the abandoned mine, the secrets buried within them. They were not as dormant as Jedediah believed. They were merely waiting for the right person to stir them from their slumber. The midday heat shimmered off the vast expanse of the Double R Ranch, distorting the familiar landscape into a wavering mirage. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay, horses, and a palpable sense of unease. Jedediah found Silas diligently mending a harness, his movements precise and efficient. The foreman's quiet competence was undeniable, but it was the unsettling intensity in his eyes that unnerved Jedediah. "Heard you were asking about the north pasture well, Silas," Jedediah began, his voice deliberately casual, hoping to steer the conversation away from the sensitive topic. Silas didn't look up immediately. He continued to work the thick leather, his fingers deftly manipulating the needle and thread. "Just trying to get the lay of the land, Mr. Thorne. Understand the water sources. Seems like an important part of ranch operations." Jedediah leaned against a sturdy wooden post, crossing his arms. "It is. But that particular well, it's been dry for years. Caved in about a decade ago. No sense wasting time on it." He watched Silas's hands, searching for any reaction. Silas finally paused, his gaze meeting Jedediah's. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his expression, a hint of something knowing. "Dry, you say? Funny. Old man Hemlock, who used to run this place before you, he had a reputation for hoarding water. And that well, folks said it was deep. Deep enough to tap into something reliable, even in a drought." Jedediah felt a prickle of irritation, mingled with a growing apprehension. Hemlock. The name alone brought a bitter taste to his mouth. Hemlock was a fool, and that well is sealed. Completely. No one's been down there in a long time. He tried to project an air of finality, of a closed chapter. Silas gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's. "Sealed, you say? That's a strong word, Mr. Thorne. Strong enough to keep something buried forever?" He resumed his work, the rhythmic stitching a counterpoint to the unspoken tension. "I've seen old wells before. Sometimes they just need a bit of clearing out. New pipes, a good pump. Might surprise you what you find." Jedediah clenched his jaw. The foreman's persistence was like a persistent fly he couldn't swat away. He knew Silas was probing, testing the boundaries. He was trying to unearth something, and Jedediah had a sinking feeling it had more to do with Sarah's past than the ranch's water supply. He remembered the hushed rumors surrounding Sarah's arrival, the whispers of a tragic past she never spoke of. Could Silas have heard them too? "There's nothing to find, Silas," Jedediah stated, his voice hardening. "It's a dead end. We have plenty of other wells, properly maintained, that provide all the water we need. Focus your efforts there." "The South 40 needs attention." Silas finished the harness, holding it up for inspection. It looked as good as new. "South 40? Right. Plenty of work to do all over, I reckon." He set the harness aside and picked up a small, tarnished metal object from his workbench. A broken gear, perhaps, or a piece of machinery. He turned it over in his fingers, his gaze distant. "This land, it holds on to things, doesn't it? Like old memories, or secrets." Jedediah watched him, a knot tightening in his stomach. He recognized the glint of the metal in Silas's hand. It was a piece of scrap, unremarkable to anyone else, but Jedediah knew Sarah kept a small box of such curiosities in her sewing room, remnants of her past life, tokens she couldn't bring herself to discard. Had Silas found it? Had he been in her room? The thought sent a fresh wave of anger and protectiveness through him. "That's just scrap, Silas," Jedediah said, forcing a neutral tone. "This is a working ranch. We don't have time for ghost stories or for digging up the past. We're here to build a future." Silas met his gaze again, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "A future, Mr. Thorne, or just a way to keep the past from catching up?" He pocketed the metal fragment. "I'll get to the South 40, and I'll keep my eyes open. You never know what you might find when you're not looking for it." As Silas left the barn, the slam of the heavy door echoed in the sudden silence. Jedediah stood for a long moment, the scent of the barn suddenly cloying. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat. Silas was more than just a foreman. He was a question mark, a disruption. And the way he looked at Sarah, the way he'd held that small piece of metal, Jedediah realized with a sickening certainty that Silas was not just interested in the ranch. He was interested in Sarah, and he was getting closer to the truth than Jedediah had ever feared. The carefully constructed walls around their lives were starting to show cracks, and Jedediah had a terrifying premonition that Silas Thorne was the one holding the hammer. The air in the ranch house dining room was heavy with unspoken anxieties. Sarah carefully set down a platter of fried chicken, her movements a little more jerky than usual. Jedediah watched her, his own tension a taut string. Martha, ever perceptive, cast knowing glances between them, her lips pursed as if holding back a torrent of questions. Silas was asking about the north pasture well again today, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, directing her words to Jedediah but loud enough for Martha to hear. She sought confirmation, a shared fear, but also perhaps a subtle warning to Martha to tread carefully. Jedediah met her gaze, a flicker of grim understanding passing between them. He was. I told him it was sealed. Collapsed. A waste of time. Martha let out a soft tut. A waste of time, you say? That well. I remember the talk. Even back then, before Mr. Hemlock, there were whispers. Old stories. Folks said it had a stubborn nature, didn't like being tamed. She paused, her eyes wide. And the mine shaft nearby. Never could understand why that was left to rot. Sarah flinched at the mention of the mine shaft. It was a topic Jedediah had carefully steered away from, a place of dark memories she desperately tried to suppress. She could feel the phantom chill of the earth, the suffocating darkness that had once held her captive. There's nothing there, Martha. Just an old, dangerous hole in the ground, best left alone. But that's just it, isn't it? Silas's voice, smooth as oiled leather, cut through the tense silence. He stood in the doorway, having entered unnoticed. His presence always seemed to arrive like a sudden gust of wind, unsettling the calm. He held a small, dirt-stained piece of metal in his hand. Sometimes what's left alone becomes even more potent. He walked towards the table, his eyes holding Sarah's. He didn't need to explain where he got the metal. Sarah knew. It was from the small collection of trinkets she kept hidden in her sewing basket, mementos of a life she'd left behind. The chipped porcelain doll's eye, a smooth dark stone, a small tarnished silver locket. He held up a fragment of what looked like decorative ironwork, twisted and rusted. Found this near the old workings, Silas said, his gaze unwavering. Doesn't look like something you'd find just anywhere on this ranch, does it? Looks familiar somehow, like it belonged to something delicate, something cherished. Sarah's breath hitched. It was a piece of a decorative gate from the small cottage where she had grown up, a place she had tried to erase from her memory, a place that held the scars of her past. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Jedediah stood, his posture protective. That's just old scraps, Silas. This ranch has a lot of history. You'll find bits and pieces everywhere if you look hard enough. Silas gave a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, I'm looking, Mr. Thorne. I'm looking very hard. He turned his attention back to Sarah, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to something more intense, more personal. It's a shame, really. A shame when beautiful things get lost or broken or buried. The implication hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud threatening to break. Sarah could feel her face paling, her hands trembling. She met Silas's gaze, a silent plea for him to stop, to leave her past undisturbed. But his eyes held a glint of something akin to triumph, as if he had just unearthed a crucial piece of a puzzle. I'm heading out to the South 40 now, Silas announced, his voice regaining its professional tone, though the underlying current of challenge remained. Lots of work to do, but if anyone needs me, you know where to find me. Probably out in the middle of nowhere, wrestling with the land. He gave a curt nod and left, the silence he left behind more deafening than his presence. Sarah sank into her chair, her legs feeling weak. The piece of ironwork, so small and insignificant, had opened a floodgate of memories, of fear. She looked at Jedediah, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't articulate. He knows, Jedediah. He knows about where I came from. Jedediah knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands in his. His grip was firm, grounding. He knows nothing, Sarah. He's guessing. He's trying to find leverage. But he won't. We won't let him. His voice was low, steady, a bulwark against the rising tide of her fear. That gatepiece, that it means nothing. We'll tell him it's from an old wagon part, anything. He's looking for something to distract us, to make us nervous. But Sarah could see the worry mirrored in Jedediah's eyes. Silas was a shadow, and his questions were digging into the very foundations of their carefully constructed life. The weight of her past, a burden she had carried for so long, felt heavier than ever. And she feared that Silas Thorne was determined to make her carry it out into the harsh light of day. The sun, A fiery orb in the vast cerulean sky cast long shadows across the dusty expanse of the Double R Ranch. A tangible sense of unease had settled over the ranch, a quiet hum of speculation that followed Silas wherever he went. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a constant, unsettling force, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Sarah found herself increasingly on edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant horse whinny, sent a jolt of apprehension through her. Silas's methods were subtle, but effective. He wasn't overtly confrontational, but he had a way of insinuating himself into conversations, of asking questions that danced dangerously close to the edges of their carefully guarded secrets. One afternoon, while Sarah was sorting through mail in the small office, Silas appeared at the open doorway. He held a coil of rope, his hands calloused and strong. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thorne?" His voice was a low rumble, polite, but with an undercurrent that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. "Silas," she replied, forcing a calm she didn't feel. She clutched a letter a little tighter. "Is there something you need?" "Just checking in," he said, stepping further into the room. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the framed photographs on Jedediah's desk, pictures of the ranch, of Jedediah and Sarah in happier times, before the shadows had begun to lengthen. "Settling in well, getting a feel for the place. It's a big spread." "It is," Sarah agreed, trying to keep her tone neutral. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Heard you mention old Hemlock's stories the other day," Silas continued, his gaze now fixed on a worn leather-bound ledger on Jedediah's desk. "Something about the North Pasture well seemed significant to you." Sarah's heart gave a lurch. She hadn't thought Silas had been close enough to overhear her conversation with Martha and Jedediah. "Just old gossip, Silas. Nothing of importance." He shrugged, a subtle movement of his shoulders. "Gossip usually starts somewhere. And Hemlock. He was a strange bird, always digging into things. Some say he knew more about this land than anyone, about what was buried here." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "And about who might have buried it." Sarah felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She understood now. Silas wasn't just curious about the ranch's history. He was actively seeking out its darkest corners, and he suspected those corners involved her. "Mr. Hemlock is long gone, Silas. And whatever secrets this land holds are best left undisturbed." Silas turned his full attention to her, his eyes holding hers. "But what if disturbing them is the only way to understand them, Mrs. Thorne? What if the past has a way of demanding to be known?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly. "Some things, even when sealed, leave traces, like a scar on the land, or a shadow in a person's eyes." Sarah felt herself recoiling, not physically, but internally. His words were a direct assault, a psychological probe. She knew he was trying to provoke a reaction, to glean information from her fear. I don't know what you mean, Silas." He offered a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't you? I've seen you, looking out towards the hills. You always seem to be watching something that isn't there, like you're waiting for someone, or something." He gestured vaguely towards the north. "Hemlock always said that part of the land held a particular kind of sadness. He claimed it was where things were forgotten." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat feeling tight. She couldn't deny the truth in his words, not entirely. The North Pasture near the old well was where the memories she tried to outrun were most potent. But to have a stranger articulate it, to have him see the ghosts that haunted her, it was too much. "I'm just resting my eyes, Silas. The sun is very bright out here." He nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "Of course, the sun." He turned and walked towards the barn, his stride confident. "Jedediah seems like a good man, Mrs. Thorne. Sturdy, dependable, built like the land itself. But even the strongest foundations can be tested, can't they? Especially when the ground beneath them isn't as solid as it seems." As Silas disappeared from view, Sarah leaned against the desk, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He was playing a game, a dangerous game of psychological warfare. He was planting seeds of doubt, not just in her mind, but potentially in Jedediah's too. She looked at the framed photograph of her and Jedediah, a forced smile on her face. They had come here to escape, to build a new life, a life free from the torment of her past. But Silas Thorne was determined to drag that past, with all its horrors, back into the light, and she feared he was succeeding. The shadow he cast was long, and it seemed to be stretching towards the very heart of their fragile peace. The relentless sun beat down on the Double R Ranch, a constant reminder of the unforgiving landscape. Inside the main house, Sarah and Jedediah sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the remains of their supper cooling between them. The conversation had been stilted, punctuated by long silences, each aware of the shadow that Silas Thorne's presence cast over their lives. "He asked about my past again today," Sarah finally said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to look at Jedediah, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns in the wood grain of the table. "He mentioned the north pasture, the well. He said he saw me looking out towards the hills like I was waiting for something." Jedediah reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. His touch was rough, but infinitely comforting. "I know, Sarah. He's trying to unnerve you. He's fishing for something he thinks he can use." "But what if he's not just fishing, Jedediah?" Her voice trembled. "What if he's getting close? He knows I'm not what I seem. He saw that piece of the gate. He's piecing things together." The memory of the small, ornate piece of ironwork, a relic of her former life, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Jedediah's grip tightened. "He's seeing what he wants to see. He's a man who likes to dig, to uncover secrets. But he doesn't know the truth. He doesn't know what happened, Sarah, and he never will unless we let him." He squeezed her hand gently. "We built this life together, on honesty, and that includes the parts that are hard to talk about." Sarah finally met his gaze, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "But I've never told you everything, Jedediah. About that night. About why I ran." The words tumbled out, a dam finally breaking. She spoke of the oppressive circumstances of her childhood, the suffocating expectations, the desperate desire for escape. She spoke of the night she fled, the terrifying journey, the fear of being found, the overwhelming guilt that had clung to her like a second skin. She confessed that the reason she and Jedediah had never conceived a child wasn't just fate, but a deep-seated fear, a psychological scar from the trauma she had endured. She hadn't been able to bear the thought of bringing a child into a world where such darkness existed, a world where she herself had been so broken. Jedediah listened intently, his expression one of profound empathy. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. When she finally fell silent, her voice hoarse, he pulled her gently towards him, her head resting on his chest. He held her close, his arms a shield against the world. "Oh, Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been carrying this all by yourself for so long." He stroked her hair, his touch soothing. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore. We carry it together. That's what this marriage is. That's what this ranch is. A place of safety. A place of new beginnings." He pulled back slightly, their foreheads touching. "And about the children," he said softly. "We've tried, Sarah. We've prayed. But if it's not meant to be, then it's not meant to be. Our life together is enough. You are enough. This ranch is our legacy and we'll make it thrive, with or without heirs." His words were a balm to her wounded soul, a reassurance that her perceived failings didn't diminish her worth in his eyes. "But Silas," Sarah whispered, the fear still lingering. "Silas is a storm, Sarah," Jedediah said, his gaze steady. "And storms pass. We'll weather this one. We'll stand together. We'll face him, and we'll protect what we've built." He looked out the window, towards the darkened hills. "He thinks he's digging up secrets, but he's just digging up old pain. And pain can be healed. It can be overcome." That night, as they lay in bed, the silence between them was no longer filled with unspoken fear, but with a newfound understanding and a strengthened resolve. Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The burden of her past, though still present, no longer felt solely hers to bear. Jedediah's unwavering love and acceptance had created a space where she could finally begin to heal. They were a team, two souls bound by shared dreams and the quiet strength of their commitment. The threat of Silas Thorne still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but for the first time Sarah felt a flicker of hope. They had faced the truth, their deepest fears, and they had emerged not broken, but stronger, their bond forged anew in the crucible of honesty and love. The morning sun rose with its usual intensity, painting the vast Wyoming sky in hues of gold and rose. Silas Thorne, however, seemed unaffected by its warmth. He moved with a quiet purposefulness, his gaze sharp and observant as he oversaw the ranch hands. His presence was a constant, low-grade hum of tension, a subtle pressure that seemed to permeate every corner of the Double R. Sarah, attempting to resume her usual routine, found herself flinching at every unexpected sound. Silas's quiet persistence, his uncanny ability to appear when she least expected him, was wearing her down. She had shared her deepest fears with Jedediah, and while his support was a source of immense strength, the threat of Silas remained. Later that morning, while Jedediah was out checking on the cattle in the far pastures, Silas approached Sarah as she was tending to the flower beds near the porch. He carried a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. "Another interesting find," Silas said, his voice smooth and even, holding the object out for her to see. "Found this tucked away in the old tack room. Seems out of place for a working ranch, wouldn't you say?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The bird. It was a miniature replica of a swallow, a symbol of hope and home carved by her father. It was one of the few small treasures she had managed to keep from her childhood, a tangible link to a life she had tried so desperately to bury. She felt a cold dread seep into her veins. He was systematically unearthing every fragment of her past. "It's just old decoration, Silas," she said, her voice tight. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to project a calm she didn't feel. "This ranch has been here a long time. Things get lost and found." Silas tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing her reaction. "Lost, perhaps, but not forgotten, Mrs. Thorne. Not by everyone." He ran a thumb over the delicate carving. "Swallows. They always return, don't they? Even after the harshest winter, they find their way back." The implication was clear, and it sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Was he suggesting she was like the swallow, destined to return to her past? Or was he hinting that the past itself would inevitably find its way back to her? "Some things are best left behind, Silas. For everyone's sake." He smiled, a slow, almost predatory smile. "But what if leaving them behind causes more damage than confronting them? What if the weight of what's hidden becomes too much to bear?" He gestured with the wooden bird towards the north pasture, the old well, the mine. "It's all connected, isn't it? A series of unfortunate events, a trail of broken things." Sarah felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a chilling fear. He was so close. He was insinuating himself into the very fabric of their lives, weaving a narrative that threatened to unravel everything. "You're mistaken, Silas. There's nothing out there but dry earth and rock, and my past is my own." Silas pocketed the wooden bird. "Is it? Or is it tied to this land, to the stories it holds? Hemlock always said there were things buried out there that would change everything, things that were meant to stay hidden, perhaps. But the earth has a way of revealing its secrets, doesn't it? Especially when it's disturbed." He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing amidst the blooming flowers, feeling as though she were wilting under his gaze. He wasn't just a foreman. He was an investigator, a relentless seeker of truth, and his chosen subject was her life, her secrets, her pain. She looked towards the distant rolling hills of the north pasture, the place where her deepest fears resided. Silas was determined to dig them up, and she knew with a growing sense of dread that he wouldn't stop until he had unearthed the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. The harsh Wyoming sun beat down relentlessly, the vast open sky offering little respite. Inside the main house of the Double R Ranch, a quiet storm was brewing. Sarah moved through her daily tasks with a forced composure, but the weight of Silas's persistent probing was taking its toll. Jedediah, though outwardly calm, shared her growing apprehension. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, the silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken worries. Sarah finally broke it, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jedediah, I'm scared. Silas, he's not just asking questions anymore. He's making implications. He found that wooden bird today, the one my father carved. He said swallows always return." Her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. "He's digging too deep. He's getting closer to everything." Jedediah reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I know, Sarah. I see it too. He's a clever man, and he's sharp. But he doesn't have the whole picture. He's working with fragments, with whispers." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "We've shared our truths, Sarah. We've built our foundation on honesty, his theories, his suspicions. They can't break that. But what if they can? Sarah's voice cracked. What if he finds something? Something in that old mine, something that proves I'm not who I say I am, that I ran from something terrible? Tears welled in her eyes. That's why we can't have children, Jedediah. It's not just fate, it's this fear inside me, this brokenness. Jedediah pulled her closer, her head resting on his shoulder. He held her tightly, his own heart aching for the burden she had carried for so long. "Oh, Sarah," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to carry this alone, never again. You are not broken. You are strong. You survived, and you chose a new life here with me. That's what matters." He stroked her hair, his touch gentle. "And as for children, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. But if not, our life together is enough. You are enough. This ranch is our legacy, and we will make it prosperous. We will not let Silas Thorne or anyone else dictate our future." The confession, raw and vulnerable, seemed to lift a weight from Sarah's shoulders. The shared honesty created a new intimacy between them, a deeper understanding that solidified their bond. They had faced their greatest fear, the fear of not being enough, the fear of their past destroying their future, and they had found strength in each other. However, as the days passed, Silas's presence continued to loom. He never directly confronted them with accusations, but his subtle questions, his pointed observations, felt like constant probes, testing the limits of their resolve. He would ask the ranch hands about any unusual activities near the north pasture, casually mentioning old Hemlock's fascination with the area. He would engage Martha in seemingly innocuous conversations, subtly steering them towards discussions about the ranch's history and its former owners. One afternoon, Sarah overheard Silas talking to one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Billy, who was known for his eagerness to please. Silas was describing the dangers of abandoned mine shafts, the unstable earth, the possibility of gas pockets. He spoke with a vividness that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She saw Billy's eyes widen with a mixture of fear and fascination. Silas was planting seeds of unease, perhaps even creating a narrative that would make any future discoveries seem like the result of reckless curiosity rather than deliberate investigation. "It's a dangerous place, that old shaft," Silas was saying, his voice low. "Easy for someone to get themselves into trouble. Easy to get lost. Easy to disappear." Sarah retreated, her heart pounding. Silas wasn't just trying to uncover their secrets. He was actively manipulating the environment, creating a web of suspicion and unease. He was a master strategist, and she feared they were losing ground. The foundation they had built, so carefully and with so much love, felt as if it were beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of Silas's shadow. The vast Wyoming sky stretched above the Double R Ranch, a canvas of endless blue that offered little solace. A palpable sense of unease had settled over the ranch, a quiet tension that seemed to emanate from Silas Thorne himself. He moved through the days with an almost unnerving calm, his keen eyes missing nothing, his subtle questions probing at the edges of their carefully guarded lives. Sarah found herself increasingly on edge. Silas's persistent inquiries, his seemingly innocent observations that carried a veiled significance, were wearing down her defenses. She had confided in Jedediah, and his unwavering support had been a source of strength, but the threat of Silas remained a dark cloud on the horizon. One sweltering afternoon, as Sarah was tending to the laundry, Silas appeared at the back door, wiping sweat from his brow. He held a small tarnished metal object in his hand. "Found this near the old well site, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice calm and even. "Looks like it might have been part of some old machinery. Thought you'd want to see it." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She recognized it immediately, a small decorative buckle, one she had worn on a cherished childhood dress. It was a relic, a piece of a past she had desperately tried to bury. She felt a cold dread wash over her. Silas was meticulously collecting fragments of her history, weaving them into a narrative he was clearly constructing. "It's just old scrap, Silas," she managed, her voice tight. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to project a calm she didn't feel. "This land has a long history. Things get left behind." Silas tilted his head, his eyes holding hers with an unnerving intensity. "Indeed they do, but some things are left behind for a reason. And sometimes, Mrs. Thorne, The reasons are worth uncovering." He gestured vaguely towards the north. "Hemlock always said that part of the land held onto its secrets tightly, like it was guarding something, or someone." Sarah's breath hitched. He was insinuating himself into her past, twisting the narrative of the land to reflect her own buried trauma. "Mr. Hemlock is long gone, Silas, and whatever secrets this land holds are best left undisturbed." Silas offered a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "But what if disturbing them is the only way to truly understand them, Mrs. Thorne? What if the truth, no matter how buried, has a way of surfacing?" He pocketed the buckle. "You seem troubled, Mrs. Thorne. This heat, perhaps?" Sarah forced a strained smile. "Just a long day, Silas. I should get back to my work." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned and walked away. Sarah leaned against the washing line, her legs feeling weak. Silas wasn't just a foreman. He was a relentless investigator, and his chosen subject was her life, her secrets, her pain. He was planting seeds of doubt, not just in her mind, but potentially in Jedediah's as well. She knew he was actively seeking any information that could corroborate his suspicions, and she feared he was getting dangerously close to the truth. The carefully constructed piece of their lives felt as if it were beginning to fray at the edges, threatened by the persistent shadow of the foreman. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the Double R Ranch, mirroring the lengthening shadows of doubt and fear that had settled over Sarah and Jedediah. Silas Thorne's relentless investigation had become an undeniable presence, a constant irritant that gnawed at the edges of their carefully constructed piece. Jedediah found Sarah in the parlor, staring out the window towards the distant, rugged peaks of the north. Her posture was tense, her gaze fixed on some unseen point on the horizon. He knew, without asking, that Silas had been by again. "He was here again this afternoon," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Showed me a piece of a buckle, said he found it near the old well, said Hemlock believed the land there was guarding secrets." She finally turned to face Jedediah, her eyes wide with a fear he hadn't seen in months. "He's not just guessing anymore, Jedediah. He's piecing it together. He's getting closer to knowing why I ran." Jedediah crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. His grip was firm, grounding. "He's getting close to a story, Sarah. A story he's trying to write. But it's not the whole truth, not our truth." He met her gaze, his own filled with a fierce protectiveness. "We've faced this together. We've shared our deepest fears. That bond, that honesty, is stronger than any secret he thinks he's uncovering." He stood, pulling her up to face him. "He's been asking Martha questions too, about Hemlock, about the old days, trying to find anyone who might have heard something." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "I'll speak to him. Directly. I'll make it clear that he needs to focus on the ranch and leave the past where it belongs." But even as he spoke, Jedediah knew it wouldn't be that simple. Silas Thorne was a man driven by a hidden agenda, his probes becoming more pointed, more personal. Sarah's fragile peace was constantly under siege, and the emotional toll was becoming increasingly evident. Her sleep was troubled, her appetite diminished, and the spark that Jedediah loved so much seemed to be dimming under the weight of their shared anxiety. Later that evening, as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Jedediah found Silas by the corral, checking on the horses. The air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and horse. "Silas," Jedediah began, his voice calm but firm, "I understand you're trying to get a full picture of the ranch, but I've noticed you've been asking a lot of questions about the north pasture, about Hemlock, about things that happened long before I took over." Silas turned, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Just trying to understand the land, Mr. Thorne. It has a history, and history has a way of repeating itself, doesn't it? This ranch has a future, Silas," Jedediah stated, stepping closer. "And that's what I hired you to help build, not to dredge up old ghosts. Sarah is my wife, and her past is her own. I won't have it disturbed or used as some kind of leverage." Silas's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Leverage? Mr. Thorne, I'm simply trying to understand the full scope of this operation, and that includes any unique challenges the land might present, like that old well, or the mine. They're still there, aren't they? Waiting." He paused, a subtle shift in his demeanor. "Waiting for someone to come looking, or perhaps for someone to finally reveal what they've been hiding." Jedediah felt a surge of anger, but he held it in check. "There's nothing to hide, Silas. Just land that's been left untended. My wife has suffered enough. I won't have her tormented by shadows from her past." Silas offered a slight knowing nod. "Tormented by shadows? Or by the truth, Mr. Thorne? Sometimes they look very much alike." He turned back to the horses, his voice low. "I'll focus on the South 40 as you wish. But the North pasture, it's hard to ignore when it calls so loudly." As Jedediah walked back to the house, he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Silas's words, though veiled, were a clear indication that he suspected more than just an unhappy past. He was hinting at something more, something deliberately concealed, something that involved the North pasture, the well, and the abandoned mine. The reckoning was approaching, and Jedediah feared that Silas Thorne was determined to be the one to bring it about, no matter the cost. The late autumn sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the Blackwood Ranch. The air, once crisp with the promise of harvest, now carried a chill that seeped into the very bones of the land, mirroring the emotional climate that had settled over the inhabitants. Silas stood at the corral, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the Rockies, a landscape as formidable and unyielding as the internal struggle that had consumed him for months. The decision he had to make felt like a boulder pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush the fragile peace he had painstakingly cultivated. Eleanor, ever observant, had noticed the deepening lines of worry etched around Silas's eyes. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his jaw tightened when a particular thought held him captive. Her own heart ached with a quiet dread, a premonition that the equilibrium they had found was about to shatter. She had come to this ranch seeking escape, but she had found something far more profound, a quiet strength in Silas, a shared understanding of unspoken pain, and a nascent affection that dared to bloom in the most unlikely soil. Yet, the spectre of Silas's promise to his wife, a promise he never spoke of but that hung heavy in the air, was a constant, gnawing anxiety. She understood the weight of a dying wish, the burden of legacy, and she feared that her own inability to provide a child would ultimately render her invisible in Silas's life, just as the land itself sometimes felt barren and forgotten. Clara, too, felt the shift. The boisterous energy that had characterized her arrival had mellowed into a more profound sense of belonging, intertwined with an undeniable anxiety. She had poured her heart and soul into the small plot of land adjacent to Silas's, her resilience tested by drought and loneliness. Silas's quiet support, his gruff kindness, had been a lifeline. She admired his unwavering dedication to his ranch, his silent strength, and she found herself increasingly drawn to his stoic demeanor, seeing beneath it a man of deep integrity and unspoken sorrow. The knowledge of his wife's dying wish gnawed at her. It was a silent competitor, an invisible barrier between her growing feelings and the possibility of a shared future. She knew Silas needed an heir, a continuation of his legacy, and the cruel hand of nature had denied her that very capacity. The thought of him choosing someone else, someone who could fulfill that promise, was a bitter pill to swallow, a prospect that threatened to extinguish the flicker of hope she had dared to nurture. One evening, as a biting wind whipped through the sparse cottonwoods surrounding the ranch house, Silas finally broke his silence. He found Eleanor by the hearth, her needlework laid aside, her gaze lost in the dancing flames. He sat beside her, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. "Eleanor," he began, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse and emotion. There's something I must discuss with you, something I should have spoken of sooner." Eleanor's heart gave a lurch. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, desperate readiness. "I am listening, Silas." He took a deep breath, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs filling his lungs. "My wife, Martha, before she passed, she made me promise her something, a promise I've struggled to keep. She wanted a child, an heir, to carry on the Blackwood name, the ranch." He paused, his gaze drifting to a faded daguerreotype on the mantelpiece. Martha, young and vibrant, her smile full of life. She knew her own health was failing. She asked me to find a woman who could give me that. The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her, a chilling confirmation of her deepest fears. Infertility was not just a personal tragedy, it was a societal expectation, a cruel lottery she had lost. "And you have been searching?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hands clenching in her lap. Silas's gaze fell. "I haven't actively searched, not in the way you might think, but the weight of it's been a constant companion. The land, it needs a future, and I carry the burden of her wish." He finally looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain. "I've seen the kindness in your heart, Eleanor, the quiet strength you possess, but I know your circumstances too, and I know mine." Across the ranch, Clara was tending to her small flock of chickens, the familiar routine a comforting balm against her own gnawing unease. She had seen Silas's somber mood, the way he seemed to withdraw into himself. She suspected the truth, the unspoken reason for his silent turmoil. She had overheard snippets of hushed conversations, seen the way Silas's gaze would sometimes linger on Eleanor, a look of shared understanding, or perhaps regret. Clara's own longing for a child was a raw wound, a constant ache that no amount of hard work or resilience could soothe. She had come to the West seeking a new beginning, a chance to build a life, and in Silas, she had found a man who stirred something deep within her, a quiet hope that perhaps, against all odds, a different kind of family could be forged. But the spectre of Silas's promise, the undeniable need for an heir, loomed large, a shadow over her burgeoning feelings. She knew with a certainty that chilled her that if Silas was bound by that promise, her own barrenness would be an insurmountable obstacle. The following day, Silas found himself on horseback, the vast prairie stretching out before him, an endless canvas of muted browns and greys. He rode towards Clara's homestead, the wind whipping his hat against his brow. He needed to speak with her, to confront the unspoken currents that flowed between them, to finally acknowledge the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. He saw her by her small cabin, a solitary figure against the immense landscape, her back to him as she mended a fence. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Clara," he called out, his voice carrying on the wind. She turned, surprised by his unannounced visit. Her eyes, usually bright with a determined spark, held a shadow of apprehension. "Silas, is everything all right?" He walked towards her, the words catching in his throat. He looked at her, at the strength etched in her face, the resilience that had brought her this far. He knew the depth of her longing, the pain she carried, a pain that mirrored his own in its own way. "Clara," he began, his voice softer now, tinged with a weariness that seemed to age him. "I need to speak with you about something important, something Martha, my late wife, she made me promise her," he explained, his voice low and steady, the words a stark confession of his marital obligation and his internal conflict. He spoke of the desire for an heir, the weight of his promise, the pressure he felt to continue his lineage. Clara listened, her face paling with each word, her hands stilling on the fence post. She had suspected, but the confirmation was a blow nonetheless. The same cruel fate that had marked her own life had also presented itself as a formidable barrier to any potential happiness with Silas. I understand, Silas," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. "The land, and your wife's wish. It is a heavy burden." Her gaze fell, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "And where does that leave me?" Silas met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a profound sadness. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the echo of his own despair. He knew in that moment that the choice before him was not merely about fulfilling a promise, but about the very essence of human connection, about the possibility of building a future, not just on legacy, but on shared hearts. Even if those hearts bore the same scars of barrenness. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that underscored the stark reality of their individual heartbreaks and the agonizing decisions Silas was yet to make. The days following Silas's confessions to both Eleanor and Clara were fraught with a palpable tension. The silence in the ranch house was no longer a comfortable companion, but a heavy shroud, muffling unspoken fears and desires. Silas, usually a man of few words, found himself wrestling with a maelstrom of emotions. The clear-cut duty he had felt towards his promise to Martha now seemed blurred, entangled with the complex feelings that had begun to unfurl between him and the two women who had inadvertently become central to his life. Eleanor, though outwardly composed, felt a storm raging within. Silas's revelation about his wife's dying wish had confirmed her worst fears, that her own infertility was an insurmountable obstacle. She had always known the importance of an heir in this era, the societal pressure on men to secure a legacy, but knowing it was the direct reason for Silas's internal turmoil, and potentially the reason he could never truly see her as more than a temporary solace, was a crushing blow. She had started to find a quiet comfort in the rhythm of ranch life, in Silas's understated presence, and in the shared glances that spoke of a budding understanding. Now that fragile hope felt like it was slowly unraveling, its threads frayed by the weight of expectation and the stark reality of her barrenness. She spent long hours by the window, watching the vast, indifferent landscape. The stark beauty of the plains, which had once offered a sense of peace, now seemed to mock her own emptiness. She replayed Silas's words in her mind, the raw pain in his voice as he spoke of Martha's wish. She understood the loyalty Silas felt, the deep-seated sense of obligation, but a part of her, a hopeful, yearning part, wondered if there wasn't another path, a way to build a future that didn't solely depend on the miracle of childbirth. She remembered conversations with her own mother, whispers of other forms of family, of chosen bonds, of love that transcended biological ties. These were radical thoughts for the time, whispers of a different kind of future, and she clung to them like a drowning woman to driftwood. Clara, too, felt the ground shifting beneath her. Silas's confession had solidified her dread. The promise of an heir was a direct negation of her own dreams, a cruel irony that she, a woman who longed for children, was incapable of fulfilling this one crucial requirement. The resilience that had carried her through drought and hardship felt tested in a way it never had before. Her feelings for Silas had grown from a place of gratitude and admiration into something deeper, a quiet, unwavering affection. She saw his integrity, his strength, his underlying vulnerability, and her heart ached for the burden he carried. She found herself working her land with a feverish intensity, as if to outrun the sorrow that threatened to engulf her. Each furrow she ploughed, each seed she sowed, was a silent prayer, a desperate attempt to hold on to the possibility of a future. But the image of Silas, his brow furrowed with worry, his gaze distant, haunted her. She knew he was torn, and she understood the societal imperative he faced. Yet the thought of him choosing Eleanor, or worse, leaving the ranch in search of someone who could fulfill his promise, was a prospect too painful to bear. One blustery afternoon, as Silas was mending a section of fence near Clara's homestead, she approached him, her usual spirited demeanor subdued. The wind tugged at her shawl, mirroring the turbulence within her. "Silas," she began, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl, I've been thinking about what you said, about Martha's wish." He turned, his expression etched with fatigue. He saw the pain in her eyes, the quiet resignation that settled upon her features. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle, "it's a difficult thing." "It is," she agreed, her gaze sweeping across the vast, empty plains. I want you to know, I understand the importance of an heir. It's a part of life that has been denied to me, but I understand its significance, especially for a rancher like yourself with so much invested." She paused, taking a shaky breath. If your heart leads you to Eleanor because she might be able to fulfill that promise, or if you feel you must seek elsewhere, I will understand." Her words, though spoken with apparent resignation, held a profound sadness, a deep well of unspoken longing. Silas felt a pang of guilt, a sharp awareness of the pain he was inflicting, both intentionally and unintentionally. He saw in Clara a mirror of his own struggle, a woman fighting against the limitations imposed by fate and society. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have shown me more strength and resilience than anyone I know. Your spirit, it is something I deeply admire." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, the conflict raging within him. "But Martha's wish, it weighs on me. It's a promise I made." As the conversation ended, a silent understanding passed between them. Both women, in their own ways, were acknowledging the insurmountable obstacle of their infertility in the context of Silas's promise. Eleanor, in the quiet of the ranch house, began to draft a letter, her hand trembling as she poured her complex emotions onto the page, a mix of love, resignation, and a desperate plea for understanding. Clara, back at her homestead, looked at her small, thriving garden, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the bleakness in her heart. She knew that while she could cultivate life in the soil, the one life she yearned to nurture within herself remained an impossible dream, a dream that might cost her the man she was beginning to love. The threads of their lives, once seemingly woven together by shared circumstance, were now beginning to fray, pulled taut by the unbreakable promise that Silas carried. The wind that swept across the Blackwood Ranch in the final days of autumn carried the scent of change. It rustled through the drying grasses, whispering of challenges overcome and new beginnings. Silas stood on the porch, watching the first tentative snowflakes of winter begin to drift down, each one a silent testament to the passage of time and the inevitability of decision. The internal storm that had raged within him for so long had finally subsided, leaving behind a quiet clarity, a profound understanding of what truly mattered. He had spent sleepless nights wrestling with his promise to Martha. He had honored her memory, cherished her wish, but he had also come to realize that a promise made in grief should not bind him to a future devoid of genuine connection and love. He had seen the strength, the resilience, and the quiet dignity of both Eleanor and Clara. He had witnessed their shared pain, their mutual respect, and the unexpected bonds that had formed between them in the crucible of their circumstances. He understood now that an heir, while a symbol of legacy, was not the only measure of a fulfilling life. He had sought out Eleanor first, finding her by the window, her gaze fixed on the vast, snow-dusted plains. He sat beside her, the silence now different, no longer heavy with dread but pregnant with anticipation. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Eleanor," he began, his voice steady, free of the previous turmoil. "I've done a lot of thinking, about Martha, about her wish, and about you." He looked into her eyes, seeing the apprehension, the hope, the quiet strength that had drawn him in. "Martha wanted me to have a family, to carry on the Blackwood name, but she also wanted me to be happy. And I have come to realize that true happiness isn't just about continuing a bloodline. It's about building a life with someone you care for, someone who understands you, who stands by you." He squeezed her hand. "I know your heart has been wounded, and I know the circumstances that bind us, but Eleanor, I have come to care for you deeply. Your kindness, your quiet strength, the way you face hardship with such grace, it has touched me in ways I didn't expect." He paused, searching her face for understanding. "I cannot offer you the certainty of children, no one can, but I can offer you a partnership, a life together, here, on this ranch, a future we build side by side, whatever that future may hold." Eleanor's eyes welled up, tears tracing paths down her cheeks, but these were tears of relief, of profound gratitude, of burgeoning hope. Silas's words were not a dismissal of her infertility, but an acknowledgement of its reality, coupled with an unwavering offer of love and commitment. It was a choice that transcended the societal norms, a testament to a love that was willing to embrace imperfection, to find strength in shared vulnerability. Later that day, Silas rode to Clara's homestead. The snow was falling more steadily now, blanketing the land in a soft white hush. He found Clara tending to her small flock, her movements efficient and practiced, yet a subtle sadness seemed to cling to her like the winter frost. He dismounted, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Clara," he called out, his voice warm. She turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly followed by a look of quiet apprehension. She had braced herself for the finality of his decision. "Clara," Silas said, approaching her, "I have spoken with Eleanor, and I have made my decision." He met her gaze directly. "I cannot fulfill Martha's wish in the way she intended, nor in the way society dictates. My promise was to her, but my life is here now, and I have realized that continuing a legacy isn't solely about blood. It's about building something enduring, something that matters." He offered her a small, genuine smile. "I admire your spirit, Clara. Your tenacity, your unwavering hope even in the face of hardship. You have shown me what it means to truly persevere. And while I cannot offer you a marriage or the possibility of children, I can offer you something else. A partnership, your homestead, my ranch. They are not so far apart. We can work together, support each other, share in the triumphs and the struggles. You are a vital part of this land, Clara, and I would be honored to have you as a true neighbor, a trusted ally. We can build something lasting together in our own way. Clara stared at him, her heart swelling with a complex mix of emotions. It wasn't the romantic union she might have once dreamed of, but it was an offer of respect, of partnership, of a shared future on the land they both loved. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, independent of her ability to bear children. It was a lifeline, a new horizon. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the white landscape, but they were tears of acceptance, of a newfound peace, of the realization that a life rich in purpose and connection could be forged, even without the one thing she had so deeply yearned for. The snow continued to fall, covering the land in a pristine blanket. Silas returned to the ranch house where Eleanor waited. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. It was not the fairy tale ending Martha might have envisioned, but it was a real ending, a grounded one built on honesty, respect, and a profound appreciation for the imperfect, resilient human spirit. They would face the future together, two souls scarred by loss but united by love, ready to build a new kind of family on the silent, sprawling plains of the West. The story of the two infertile brides and the silent rancher was not one of tragedy, but of courageous choices, of finding hope in unexpected places, and of embracing a future shaped not by fate, but by the unwavering strength of the human heart.